Okay, everybody, I am making sure that I am very comfortable. Whatever chair you are in, make sure that you are comfortable as well. Or I also highly recommend that you listen to these episodes while you're cleaning or on a walk or something. Especially this one, because it's going to be one of the longer episodes. It might even be, we'll see when all is said and done. This might be the longest episode I've ever done. Today is July 26th, 2025, so this is all still very fresh and new. Everyone's day was interrupted on July 22nd, 2025, when they saw the headline that Ozzy Osbourne had passed away at his home in England. I remember when I saw the headline, Ozzy Osbourne had died, I thought, Ozzy doesn't know how to die. How is this even possible? Ozzy Osbourne truly has had 9 lives. And in fact, when I was writing the episode for today, I wanted to call it The 9 Lives of Ozzy Osbourne. Didn't even realize there is already a documentary out there called The 9 Lives of Ozzy Osbourne. I will find it and I will obviously link it in the description down below. But I'm still going to call this episode The 9 Lives of Ozzy Osbourne because it is just so true. And I was so shocked to see that he had passed on. Even Tony Iommi was shocked that Ozzy had passed. The two were reportedly texting each other the day before like nothing was wrong. Tony did say he thought Ozzy didn't look that great at the farewell show. He was also just going through a lot, and I don't think anybody knew what was coming just a few days after that farewell show. But we will get to those specifics later, because there's a lot that I would like to say today. You know, if there's one thing I cannot stand, it's someone who doesn't truly know how great of a man Ozzy Osbourne actually was. Many people jump to conclusions about him and also don't realize how strong he was and how many times death came knocking on his door and he refused to answer. There's really not that many people out there, especially rock stars, also who possessed Ozzy's humility, his work ethic, and his downright sense of humor. You know, many people look at Sharon and think, how could she have stayed with Ozzy all those years? But Ozzy is proof that divine music intervention exists and that you will never leave this earth until it is truly your time. I hope that in today's Roots Music History episode, I not only pay tribute to Ozzy Osbourne and his incredible life, but that we take a moment to appreciate as well everything he went through during his time on Earth. And perhaps after learning more about the man Ozzy Osbourne really was, you'll understand why Sharon stayed too. One major admiration I personally have for Ozzy Osbourne is how he came from so little and ended up making such a huge life for himself. John Michael, aka Ozzy Osbourne, later crowned the, quote, Prince of Darkness and a pioneer of heavy metal, was born on December 3rd, 1948, in Aston, Birmingham, England. Ozzy was the 4th of 6 children, born to John Thomas, aka Jack Osbourne, a tool maker for General Electric, and Lillian Osbourne, who worked night shifts at a car parts factory. Car parts factory, say that fast 10 times. The family of 8 lived in a very small 2-bedroom home at 14 Lodge Road in Aston, a very working class district. His hometown was known as an impoverished working class village, easily identified by its soot-filled skies, constant factory smoke, and very narrow streets. The Osbourne family struggled to make ends meet, to say the least. Ozzy says his father never, ever missed a work shift. No matter how sick he felt or how hot it was outside, no matter what, his father was always up and ready to work. Same exact thing with his mother as well. She was a very hard-working homemaker during the day and then would turn around and work night shifts at the car factory. Ozzy said he always had, though, this sense of doom as a child. Like his dad would be sleeping and he'd be worried that his dad had died. So he remembers trying to wake up his dad from naps often to make sure that he was just still breathing. Ozzy knew that an education could be his ticket out of this working class struggle, but to his dismay, he had a horrible time at school. academically and socially. For one thing, he was heavily dyslexic, which quickly led to classmates bullying him and even the teachers just getting frustrated with him and making him feel horrible about himself. For a long time as a kid, Ozzy felt trapped in this blue-collar environment because of that. And for a short period of time, he accepted this fate. At age 14, he left school completely and took on several blue-collar, low-paying jobs. He worked at a slaughterhouse for a period of time, where his main job was cleaning up the animal remains, a job he later said left him nauseated, but at the same time, fascinated with gore, which of course would later influence some of his future stage theatrics. He also worked as a horn tuner at a car factory, a role I did not know existed. Ozzy also said that being a horn tuner at the car factory was very noisy and loud. But in all seriousness, this job did actually expose his ears to the constant volume of industrial noise and, of course, the honking of horns, which can make anyone feel a little mad. He was also a plumber's apprentice for a few months before landing a job at a steel factory, which paid well, but also exposed him to heavy fumes, which made him nearly pass out on more than one occasion. But just because Ozzy may have been slow at some things, definitely didn't mean he was stupid. He knew working these low-paying jobs in an inflationary environment wasn't going to be sustainable. So as he entered his teenage years, he started doing what many other teenagers in town did. He started turning to petty crimes. He says he almost hoped at times he would get caught from these crimes just because he thought maybe his peers would find some level of respect for him if they knew he was out there, being a little rowdy, being a little risky. But it wasn't just petty crimes the kids were getting involved with in this impoverished Birmingham neighborhood. There was also a lot of heavy drinking and cannabis. And even words I can't say on YouTube because I will get banned. And as you know, this podcast is primarily housed on YouTube. But he did end up getting arrested several times, mainly just for minor thefts like stealing. I don't think it was ever for possession of anything, although it definitely could have been. But at age 17, he actually spent 6 weeks in Winson Green Prison for failing to pay a fine. While throughout his teenage years, he admits he was hoping to get caught, he definitely didn't want to actually go to prison. He actually hated prison. Being there scared him. And ever since that instance, he led himself away from these little petty crimes and started focusing more of his attention on his favorite escape, other than drugs. I need to say something else because YouTube won't let me say the DRGS word. So I think instead of saying DRGS, I will say medicating. I'll say medication and self-medicating or something to that effect. So if I say that, know that I am referring to substances. So other than his medication escape, his other favorite escape was music. And of course, he was still working in his late teenage years. He returned to a few of his blue-collar jobs after getting out of prison, and he made it a point to save as much money as possible and to live on as straight a line as possible. He wanted to live a good life. He didn't want to live a bad life, and he didn't want to be stuck in this small, impoverished English town. By 1966, Ozzy Osbourne was 18 years old. He started playing in local pubs and clubs after work, covering artists like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. His nickname had always been Ozzy since school, short for Osbourne, his last name, so he just kept using that nickname, and it became a little local stage name that obviously eventually stuck. It was also super common, not just for Ozzy, but for the people around him as well, to be taking self-medications before working at a factory or before performing a gig. It was just normal for people in that town. Through his blue-collar jobs and his local performances, Ozzy eventually saved enough money to buy himself a full PA system and microphone. This was a big deal for a kid of his social status to buy this type of equipment. This was his first major life purchase. The PA system itself wasn't a name brand touring rig, but that was all right. It was a second-hand, small, club-sized speaker and amplifier set. Good enough to handle his local gigs, by far. Not big enough for a huge concert hall, but Ozzy wasn't playing in big concert halls, obviously, so this was perfect for him at this time. And the microphone was a Shure Unidyne, I think I'm saying that right, 3, one of the earliest dynamic vocal microphones that had been built out there. In his autobiography, I Am Ozzy, Ozzy said this purchase, quote, changed everything. Because like I said, most singers, especially in that area, did not have their own gear. So local bands started hiring Ozzy, purely because he had the right equipment. In fact, this investment is often credited as the reason Geezer Butler, a local guitarist turned bassist, even considered Ozzy as a vocalist for his band in 1967, The Rare Breed. This was pivotal, by the way, if you don't know, to the eventual formation of Black Sabbath. The Rare Breed band, of course, didn't last very long, but Ozzy and Geezer stayed connected after the band broke up. In 1968, Geezer introduced Ozzy to 2 other local musicians, Tony Iommi and Bill Ward. Tony and Bill were playing in another local band called Mythology. Mythology would also ultimately break up in that same year, causing Tony, Ozzy, Geezer, and Bill to join together in their own blues rock band they decided to call Earth. Earth played blues and jazz covers locally until another band with the same name came onto the scene and started to cause some major confusion.
So we became the Originals,
Right.
and we had to change our name, actually.
Well, there's another group in the East End called the Originals, and we had to rename ourselves.
The New Originals.
New Originals.
Yeah.
While all of this was happening, by the way, a movie had recently been released internationally called Black Sabbath. It was a horror film, and 1 year after forming Earth, and in the midst of this other band, Earth, and all of the confusion that was starting to go on with the different band names, Geezer, Ozzy, Tommy, and Bill were all rehearsing one day next to a movie theater that was playing the movie Black Sabbath. The band went in and saw the movie, and all they could think about was how people were actually willing to spend their hard-earned money to watch such a horrible and gory film. And then the band had an idea. Why not shift their music from this vanilla blues and rock that they were doing to this like horrific and theatrical, dark, shock rock and roll style? And why not, while they're at it, rename themselves Black Sabbath? Now, keep in mind, this was popular in the late 60s and the early 70s, following the mid-60s birth of Screamin' Jay Hawkins. You also had shock rock figures like Alice Cooper coming onto the scene, especially like right during this time. So the boys were really excited about this, and they knew they were onto something new, innovative, and relevant in the music scene. They immediately started writing all new original music with these dark and like ominous themes. Iommi started incorporating these very creepy, like down-tuned riffs, which even further created this heavy and eerie undertone to their songs. At this time, too, I think it's worth noting that Ozzy's substances and alcohol and medications were not completely out of control. I would say they were not out of control whatsoever. Yes, it existed, but that was something that a lot of local musicians were dabbling with recreationally, for lack of better words. Now, perfectly timed, it was February of 1970 when the album for Black Sabbath was ready for release. And there was a Friday the 13th right there on the calendar. So on Friday, February 13th, 1970, their debut album, Black Sabbath, was officially released in the UK. And the album did surprisingly well for this very strange new band. It peaked at number 8 on the UK albums chart soon after its release, and also as number 23 on the US Billboard 200. Completely energized by its success, the band immediately went to work to put out more albums. In just 3 years, from 1970 to 1973, Black Sabbath put out 5 full albums. All while Ozzy was in his early 20s. Ozzy was 22 in 1970. So to put it in perspective even further, Black Sabbath released 8 albums from 1970 to 1978, which means Ozzy worked on and released 8 albums with them from age 22 to age 30. Not only was Ozzy still extremely young, but he was seeing money hit his bank account in his early 20s that he had only dreamed about, money that he didn't even think he would ever see, especially just a few years prior as a blue-collar working teen. He never imagined in his wildest dreams he'd ever even make it out of Birmingham, nonetheless be touring internationally. But with this incredible success also brought Ozzy a deeper desire to not just fit into this world and be accepted by the people in it, but to also dominate it and dominate his current role as a musician. You know, he was on top during this time and he felt like a king. So he wanted to live like one too. It really wasn't until Black Sabbath started seeing their major successes that Ozzy started desperately searching for any kind of self-medication that was available, which sometimes was not easy to find when he was out on the road. But like I said, he would take whatever he could get. He started in on all sorts of things he had never dabbled with before, but things that were readily available to him. At first, it was mainly as a tool to try to perform and keep going, but it also just became a habit for him, something that he could not let go of. You know, at that point, Ozzy had literally trained his brain to be in this constant state of chaos. So if he wasn't in a state of chaos, then his nervous system literally thought something was wrong. And he'd search in desperation for anything to take him away from a calm baseline, what we would consider as a normal person baseline, to what he would consider his baseline, which was just a very chaotic state. Even though all the other band members in Black Sabbath were also self-medicating, it wasn't to the level of Ozzy. Tommy Iommi later said that in an interview that recording sessions with Ozzy were like trying to make an album in a lunatic asylum. By 1978, the band was struggling on multiple levels. They were still wildly successful, don't get me wrong, but their ticket sales had dipped compared to their early 1970s heyday. They started arguing and even, dare I say, panicking that they were losing their fan base. I think in a lot of ways, the band needed something to blame it on, something tangible, other than perhaps just the fact they were not doing as well as they were. And Ozzy was the first person to take the blame for Black Sabbath's low sales. After all, Ozzy was known for frequently missing sound checks and even failing to show up sober at all. Ozzy started to pick up on the fact that his band was mad at him and didn't like him anymore, for lack of better words, and he could not stand that feeling. So as a coping mechanism, he threw himself into a weeks-long isolation in a hotel room in LA. This was right after the Never Say Die tour had ended. While Tom, Geezer, and Bill all continued writing and having sessions there in LA, Ozzy refused to leave his hotel room. He admitted to doing nothing but drinking and self-medicating all day. Ozzy later recalled these weeks and said, "I thought my life was over. I just locked myself in a hotel room, did medications, and just wanted to die." It all came to a head in 1979 when Black Sabbath officially decided to fire Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy himself later admitted, "I was just out of it. I'd given up caring. They had no choice but to get rid of me." While Ozzy was in this downward spiral, Black Sabbath's manager, Don Arden, would have his daughter Sharon go check in on him. It seemed like Sharon was one of the only people, if not the only person, Ozzy would let into his hotel room during this. So Sharon quickly became instrumental in pulling Ozzy out of this LA downward spiral. And honestly, if it weren't for her, he very well may have died in that LA hotel room. He was certainly trying to die and admitting that he wanted to. In fact, if it weren't for Sharon, Ozzy very well may have died multiple other times too, but we will get to that as we go on in his story. Even after Ozzy was fired from Black Sabbath, Sharon remained a fighting force in his life. She convinced Ozzy he was talented and capable and convinced him to start recording again. She even helped him assemble a new band, which became the Blizzard of Oz. The original lineup, of course, being Randy Rhoads, the 22-year-old on guitar, Bob Daisley on bass, and Lee Kerslake on drums. So yes, Ozzy was fired in 1979, hit his ultimate low, but he also formed his new band in the same year and started writing and recording right away. Sharon became the official manager of Blizzard of Oz. Ozzy Osbourne had arguably lost his very first life in that LA downward spiral in that LA hotel room. But now, with the Blizzard of Oz and with Sharon, Ozzy Osbourne was officially given his second life. In early 1980, around March or April to be specific, Blizzard of Oz performed their first gigs in the UK, testing out their new songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley. Ozzy debuted his new image as well, more theatrical, but without the Sabbath darkness, but still edgy, enough to shock. On September 20th, 1980, Blizzard of Oz released their debut solo album in the UK, which quickly skyrocketed to number 7 in England and would eventually go on to sell over 5 million copies in the US. Thanks to Randy Rhoads and his insane guitar skills, Ozzy was now a solo superstar. I hope you take the time to watch my Randy Rhoads episodes as well. I will, of course, link them in the upper right-hand corner and in the description of this video, as well as at the end of the video too. So I really hope that you listen to those episodes in their entirety, because I cannot possibly speak enough in detail about Randy Rhoads. This episode is already going to be massively long, so please go watch the Randy Rhoads episodes as well. The Blizzard of Oz immediately started touring off the momentum of Crazy Train and this debut album as a whole. Even though Ozzy was completely reinventing himself professionally, he was still using heavily. And he had such a high tolerance at this point, he obviously kept requiring more and more of a substance in order to feel like he was back to his normal chaotic state. But the good news in 1980 and into 1981 is that Ozzy was not depressed. If he was, it wasn't like he had been post Black Sabbath breakup. He was quite happy. He was not self-isolating, and so most of his usage during this time was really used to make himself feel even better rather than to make himself feel better. Ozzy and Sharon both wanted to continue this rebranding of Ozzy. He was now a good Ozzy. He was a different Ozzy. He had learned from his dark Black Sabbath days and was on to bigger and brighter things with Randy Rhoads and the Blizzard of Oz. With this reinvention of who Ozzy Osbourne was, they were of course ecstatic when Epic Records had a change of heart and decided to sign him in 1980. Epic Records had, as many labels had, rejected signing Ozzy as a solo artist after his firing in 1979. Them deciding to now sign him was huge, a complete 180. So to celebrate, on March 27th, 1981, Epic Records and Blizzard of Oz arranged a big press conference and business meeting with all of the executives from Epic Records and the Blizzard of Oz band members and their whole entourage. Everybody was going to get dressed up, and it was going to be joyous and productive. Ozzy and Sharon both came up with this beautiful plan that they would bring 2 very beautiful doves to release into the air at the press ceremony, symbolic of the rebranding of the new and improved, peaceful Ozzy Osbourne. They felt as though not only would these doves be symbolic of new beginnings, but it would also be a symbolic gesture to show a softer side to Ozzy, a side that would hopefully win over other skeptical label representatives in the future. Ozzy was so excited for this moment. In fact, he was so excited that he started drinking early that day. He popped a couple pills before they left and made sure that the doves were safely nestled in their cages, ready for their big moment. However, shortly into this business meeting, Ozzy started to feel as though the label executives didn't like him. He felt like they were bored of him and dismissive of his ideas and his presence in general. He felt like they were treating him like some washed up curiosity rather than the solo superstar he'd worked so hard to prove himself to be. So, in a fit of drunken rage and defiance, Ozzy grabbed one of the doves and bit off its head and then spat it onto the table. He then picked up the second dove and did the same thing. Blood sprayed everywhere, all over the table and carpet. Everyone, obviously, went into a horrifying state of chaos, which to Ozzy was normal, of course. Security escorted Ozzy out of the building. The police were called. The employees were traumatized. One employee actually fainted, but that didn't drop him from the label. Sharon actually did her best to turn it into a PR win. She spun it around as Ozzy Osbourne, the wildest rock star alive. Like, you never know what he's gonna do next. He's crazy. Sharon was really the one who convinced Epic Records not only to keep him, but to lean into this shock rock value, promoting Ozzy as this dangerous and unpredictable showman. The incident ended up being the furthest thing from derailing his career and ultimately boosted record sales and ticket demand for the rest of 1981. Ozzy not only got lucky professionally from this dove incident, but physically, he was very lucky too. He could have contracted several fatal illnesses from biting off the heads of live birds. They carry so many different fatal bacterias, fungi, and viruses. So it was on this day of March 27th, 1981, Ozzy most definitely was given his third life. In fact, this incident was so outrageously beneficial to his career that Ozzy, in January of 1982, did it again, although not to a dove, but to a bat. The date was January 20th, 1982, and Ozzy Osbourne was at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Des Moines, Iowa. This was part of Ozzy's Diary of a Madman tour. Apparently, during this show, a fan in the audience, often said to be Mark Neal, though his name is debated, brought a dead bat to the concert. Some reports claim the bat was already dead and stiff. Others say it was alive, albeit barely alive. Fans had gotten into the habit of throwing strange objects on stage: raw meat, toy animals, snakes, sometimes live snakes, and they sort of got into this habit because Ozzy had thrown raw meat at audiences during his tour, and people kind of wanted to throw it back at him and to top him, so to speak. So this bat was thrown onto the stage mid-performance. Ozzy says he thought it was a fake bat, like rubber or plastic or just like a stuffed toy bat. So in a very dramatic gesture, he picks up the bat and bites its head off on the stage. Yeah, just like the dove. But the moment he bit it, he realized, he said, this was his direct quote, that its head came off in my mouth and I knew something was very wrong. Ozzy spat the head out and finished the show, but he knew something was very off. Like, that was not a fake bat. He was like, I don't think that was fake. Backstage, Sharon Osbourne and the crew realize and confirm the bat was real. This was not a fake bat. And not only that, but it was either deceased when Ozzy bit it, or it was still alive, like I said, albeit barely alive, and that like biting its head off killed it. So immediately the first concern is rabies. Ozzy is rushed to the hospital immediately after the show. He then underwent a series of very painful rabies shots. They said it was as a precaution, but I don't know if like they were also used. Do they also use those shots if you have rabies and they use it to reverse that effect? I'm not sure, but they said it was a precaution. Ozzy later described this as, quote, the most painful shots of my life. Ozzy said the incident really scared him far more than anything else ever did, or far more than any media backlash ever could, because he genuinely feared that he might have rabies. The story obviously also made international headlines, cementing Ozzy's image as the Prince of Darkness and the most outrageous shock rocker alive. Sharon Osbourne, rather than downplaying it, again, used this controversy as a PR movement, spinning it to make Ozzy even more notorious. Meanwhile, Ozzy is in severe pain in his lazy boy chair at home, also very scared that he has rabies. Ozzy later admitted the whole thing was not planned. In his autobiography, he said, quote, people think I do this shit on purpose, but I don't. I thought it was a toy. After I bit it, I thought I'd caught some terrible disease. The next day, I was getting rabies shots, and they hurt like hell. Ozzy was incredibly lucky, again, to say the least, that he got out of the bat-eating incident on the other side of things. For reasons only the gods of rock and roll know and understand, Ozzy was then granted his fourth life. Ozzy's fourth life would be good for 1 year. It was March 19th, 1982, during their tour of Diary of a Madman, when a very tragic plane crash took the life of Ozzy's beloved guitarist and the world's beloved guitarist, Randy Rhoads. Andrew Aycock, their tour bus driver and the pilot of that aircraft at the time, also lost his life in this crash, as did their hairdresser, Rachel Youngblood. I talk about this tragic event in its full entirety in my other Randy Rhoads episode, so of course, like I said earlier, I am going to link the Randy Rhoads episodes and videos in the description box of this video, and I will also link it in the corner and at the end of the video here. If you're listening to this on Spotify, I'm not entirely sure how the description box work on podcast platforms, but you should be able to see it there. Otherwise, if you're not on the YouTube platform, head over to YouTube and type in Roots, Music, History, Randy Rhoads documentary. Because there's absolutely no way that I can talk about it in a way that it deserves in this period of time in this episode. It truly is its own full Roots narrative. So please go watch that video about that tragic plane crash that involved Randy Rhoads, his guitarist. Because Ozzy was on that bus and narrowly missed being struck by the plane. The plane clipped the bus before crashing. If it had just hit the bus at a slightly different angle, at a slightly different degree, Ozzy would have been gone. His life would have been taken by that plane crash. Even though Ozzy was a surviving band member from this unfathomable tragedy, if you are counting his 9 lives, he most definitely lost one that day. And with that, March of 1982, Ozzy Osbourne is granted his 5th life. Even though Ozzy was granted another chance at life, that didn't necessarily mean he wanted to live after this tragedy. He, of course, turned even more heavily into his self-medications and alcohol. One night in late 1983, while on the Bark at the Moon tour, Ozzy stopped breathing. He had been binging heavily for days. He had been blacked out for days. And one night in particular had mixed so many sedatives with his liquor that he became completely unresponsive. Not just a little bit. This wasn't just one of those moments where Ozzy was just sort of out of it. No, he was completely unresponsive to the point where Sharon and members of his road crew could not wake him. And they knew this was different. Something was really wrong. They panicked, believing he was either about to die or had died. One of the roadies reportedly performed very crude version of mouth-to-mouth and chest compressions, while Sharon called for medical help. Ozzy eventually gasped and regained shallow breathing just as the paramedics were arriving. Sharon was then told by paramedics that Ozzy had suffered a near-fatal overdose, and that if he had gone even just another minute without help, he would have died. Doctors warned him that his heart and respiratory system were under immense strain, to say the least, and continuing at this pace could and would kill him. Ozzy himself has described this moment as one of his, quote, many deaths, and a moment when he believes Sharon and his crew literally brought him back to life, or kept him alive. In later interviews, Ozzy does sort of lump this moment in with other overdose moments, and he says it in more of a general way, saying that there were a few nights Sharon says she thought he was gone, and that was one of them, that he just stopped breathing, and he sort of says it like it happened multiple times, which it did. He would be out of it multiple times, and I'm sure he stopped breathing a few times, but it does seem as though this night in late 1983 was particularly bad, and for that reason, we treat it as the moment he lost his fifth life. Ozzy's sixth life would come to an end 5 years later. It was September 3rd, 1989. 5 years into his sixth life, Ozzy and Sharon were together at the Osbourne family home in England. Ozzy was on a severe binge that night, and for the days leading up to that night had been on a severe binge. Sharon actually said she felt really nervous and unsettled with this particular binge behavior because Ozzy seemed, as she described it, unusually calm. And she said that wasn't how he would typically act during a binge. He would act chaotic and crazy, but he was like eerily calm. And according to Sharon, she was sitting on the couch in their living room, and Ozzy was just sitting right across from her in his chair. She said Ozzy just started staring at her in a very strange, emotionless way. And then suddenly, in a very flat, matter-of-fact tone, Ozzy said to her, "We've come to a decision that you've got to die." Before she could even say what, he then lunged and wrapped his arms around her neck, attempting to strangle her. Sharon immediately fought back, and in this struggle, she managed to press their home security panic button, which immediately summoned the police. And she was able to do that right before she lost consciousness. The police arrived, and Sharon survived, but she was very shaken and, for the most part, uninjured. Authorities then arrested Ozzy for attempted murder, and he spent time in jail before being released on bail. The court ordered him into an inpatient rehab facility, initially separating him from Sharon for 6 whole months. And Sharon said at this time she was seriously considering divorce, so if she hadn't been separated from Ozzy, she would have divorced him. But the fact he went into this rehabilitation center for 6 months gave her space and time to truly think about how she felt about Ozzy, how she felt about their marriage. He was the father of their children, and she loved Ozzy. She said she really missed him while he was away. And, even with all of his flaws, that was the man she married. She knew who she married. And she loved him. Sharon ultimately did not press charges. She said she believed the incident was driven by Ozzy's addiction rather than his intent. And although this pushed their relationship to the edge, she stayed with him. And this moment marked a real turning point toward Ozzy. And this was his very first serious effort at sobriety. Sharon made it very clear that had she been physically unable to hit that panic button, and if she had been cornered in any way, she would have had no choice but to fight back and defend herself. She said either he was going to kill her or she was going to have to kill him. So when he came out of rehab, she wasn't convinced he was going to stay sober, and she said to him, "Which is it? If you don't stay sober, either you kill me or I end up killing you." Those are like the only two options that we're faced with right now. So your only option is to be sober and to get out of this. She made it absolutely clear she could have killed him that night in self-defense. But again, Ozzy managed to survive. But after this attack, Ozzy definitely lost a life that night. After Ozzy was released from the inpatient rehabilitation center 6 months later, he was granted a new 7th life. His 7th life lasted the longest of them all. After leaving that rehabilitation center, Ozzy had sobered up for a long time. During the No More Tears album era, he did begin intermittently relapsing on alcohol and pills, but it was nowhere near how bad it had been. Sharon later revealed there were a few near overdose incidents where Ozzy passed out and was struggling to breathe, sometimes requiring intervention. But none of this was really publicized, and it just wasn't to the degree that it had been. He did re-enter treatment multiple times to avoid repeating his 1980s spirals. And like I said, no event was really that notable. Also, during the No More Tears tour, Ozzy did suffer severe vocal cord strain and exhaustion, coupled with, dehydration that probably was fueled even further by his uses of sedative usage, I guess I should say. And he was briefly hospitalized after a collapse in August of 1992. Doctors warned him that his heart and liver were at risk if he did not slow down yet again. From 1993 to about 1995, Ozzy Osbourne entered sort of a semi-retirement, you could call it. After the retirement tour in 1992, which was ironically named No More Tours, Ozzy largely just stayed out of the spotlight and focused on himself. He fought occasional depression and withdrawal symptoms. He also admitted to abusing prescription painkillers during this period. Sharon said she feared nightly that he just wouldn't wake up because of how much medication he was taking just to get to sleep. From 1996 to 1998, we entered into the Ozzfest era, and there were a few accidents that were associated with Ozzfest. Ozzy, of course, was back on the road during this time, and while generally healthier, he still had a few scares. In 1996, he suffered a really bad fall on stage during one of the Ozzfest shows, and this injured his back and his neck. While these injuries were not life-threatening, doctors again warned him his prescription use of self-medicating to manage pain was getting to a point that it was going to become dangerous. In late 1990, Sharon later recalled that Ozzy had at least one hospitalization for alcohol poisoning. And then in June of 2000, at a show in Pittsburgh, also part of Ozzfest, Ozzy collapsed backstage after the performance. It was initially believed to be completely due to just dehydration, but it was later reported he was suffering from severe fatigue, heat exhaustion, and a dangerous, irregular heartbeat. He was hospitalized and released after a few days, but doctors again warned him that, especially during tour, he cannot be self-medicating, at all. Just stop doing this, Ozzy. Even though none of these instances were good, they were all of a very different nature than his scares of the 1980s. Ozzy was less reckless. A lot of this was thanks to Sharon's stricter management and role as his wife, but also just due to his advancing age. And at this point, most brushes with death were tied to lingering addictions, health deteriorations, or, just physical collapses that could be attributed to a number of different factors. Nothing was that extreme, and I wouldn't say that he lost any of his lives during this time. That is until 2003, when Ozzy was 55 years old. It was December 8th, to be exact, just after his birthday. Ozzy decided to take out his Yamaha Banshee ATV for a ride around his property. He was going down a steep embankment when the ATV suddenly hit softer ground and flipped, landing on top of Ozzy and pinning him to the ground. Ozzy's bodyguard, Sam Rustin, was there and pulled the ATV off of him before performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and chest compressions. Miraculously, he was able to revive Ozzy just as paramedics arrived. Ozzy was airlifted by helicopter to Wexham Park Hospital, where he was declared to not only have 8 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, a fractured neck vertebrae that came dangerously close to severing his spinal cord, and a collapsed lung, but somehow also a new 8th life. Doctors stated Ozzy was inches from paralysis or death. One more flip or just a little bit of a harder landing could have severed his spinal cord or crushed his chest fatally. This became a turning point in his life and his career. While he continued to perform, he slowed down significantly and began focusing more and more on his health. In 2019, Ozzy was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Ozzy recalls the day he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. He says he asked the doctor if this was a terminal illness, to which the doctor replied, "No, but life is." The Parkinson's diagnosis significantly began to impact his ability to walk. This led to multiple falls, neck injuries, and surgeries, which, as you can imagine, only further aggravated that very old spinal injury from that 2003 ATV crash. In 2020, Ozzy also revealed a diagnosis of emphysema, attributed, of course, to decades of smoking, and resulted in blood clots in his legs. Ozzy canceled his 2020 North American tour to focus on treatment for his Parkinson's, and this included rehabilitation in Switzerland. Over the next few years, his physical limitations increased. Tremors, severe locomotive issues, vocal strain, and emotional challenges as he tried to adjust to this life with a chronic neurodegenerative condition. His son Jack described this period as 5 years of absolute hell for both Ozzy and the family. Ozzy performed his final show July 5th, 2025 with Black Sabbath at Villa Park in Birmingham. It was a benefit concert titled Back to the Beginning, the first original lineup since 2005. Seated on a custom throne due to his inability to stand, he delivered iconic performances, including War Pigs, Iron Man, and Paranoid, revitalizing his spirit in front of 45,000 fans and millions more who joined online. All in all, they raised about $190 million for Parkinson's research and children's charities. No one in the audience, or close to him, knew he only had 17 days left before his 8th life would expire. On July 22nd, 2025, Ozzy Osbourne was finally granted his 9th life. This final life, however, would be everlasting. Despite all his previous brushes with death, none of those instances had ever been the right time. Ozzy passed on exactly how he was meant to, surrounded by his family and in the arms of his beloved Sharon. His final social media post, shared the day before his death, featured a backstage sign that read, "Back to the Beginning, the final show." This was widely seen by fans as a subtle farewell from their rock icon. Tributes poured in from across genres and generations, from rock veterans like Elton John and Alice Cooper to modern metal and punk artists, all honoring his 5-decade influence and persona as the Prince of Darkness. Ozzy Osbourne reshaped rock and roll by redefining theatrical shock rock. Beyond his music, he was a loving husband, father, and a very humble soul. Ozzy was always willing to admit when he was wrong, and despite failing to overcome his addictions, he was always trying to pursue a righteous life. He always wanted to be accepted and to live on a straight line, not only for himself, but for his fans, his friends, and his family. What other person in this world do you know who came from such an impoverished background to international fame, a multi-million-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars actually, empire, and who has such an intense mental and physical struggle that is just unrelenting, yet still has a family that is not estranged and loves him completely to the moon and back? Who on this earth do you know? I mean, there is so much to Ozzy that we will never know because we didn't know his whole heart or know his whole soul the way those close to him knew him. But just those facts alone, you can see that Ozzy Osbourne was an incredible man. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You also have the option to give this episode specifically a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel. And it is a way of saying thank you for this episode directly. Your donations are imperative to the ongoing research and production of these stories, and I am forever grateful to anyone who has ever given me a super thanks. And of course, please go watch the story of Randy Rhoads. Like I said, it is linked in the description down below. I go into incredible detail of that plane crash and Randy's life and impact on music as a whole. So you really can't talk about Ozzy Osbourne and not talk about Randy Rhoads. And you really can't listen to an Ozzy Osbourne episode and not listen to the episode on Randy Rhoads. So please, please listen to that next. And of course, I will see you on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down, liberty